Hi, my name is Steve Rahi. I am a premier field engineer specializing in management technologies. Today's discussion is a focus on Configuration Manager 2007 and 2012 specifically in terms of how are we going to migrate away from those platforms for the customers that are still using Config Manager 2007 and 2012. What are our plans to help get off of those platforms? Because the end of life for those products is approaching very quickly. And so this discussion is geared to help you understand the options and plan for moving away from those platforms onto Configuration Manager Current Branch. So here's a bit of the agenda. Really, our discussion will fall into two major buckets. First, I want to talk about migration, some of the options there where we can bring that to bear. And then secondly, upgrade. At the end, we'll wrap up with a few thoughts about Azure Infrastructure as a Service and so on, but we'll focus mainly there. In fact, our main discussion will be on the migration piece, right? Because that is something that is required for Config Manager 2007 and so on. And I want to show you some demos of that and such. So let's get into migration. Here's our mini agenda, if you will, or our migration-specific agenda. So the question, why migrate, right? What are the requirements to actually get this done? Let's talk through a couple of supported scenarios and then define some terms, get some thoughts in place, and then look at the flow. And finally, I want to show you how to configure this, how to make it work, right? Now, let me just say at the outset, in a video like this, really can't walk through every single eventuality of how you might do this. What I'm wanting to do is introduce some concepts for how this could be done, show you some ideas or examples of how it could be done, maybe help you envision how you could do this in your own environment. There's some really good documentation out there about how to migrate data between hierarchies and so on that is relevant. So take a look out there at docs.microsoft.com. You can find that, right? And so let's focus on migration for now. So why migrate, right? Great question. Well, for Config Manager 2007, migration is required. There is no ability to upgrade, right? There's just too many differences in the back end, the database, and really Config Manager 2012 Current Branch are totally new products compared to Config Manager 2007. So a migration is required for Config Manager 2007. There could be other reasons that you might want to migrate. You know, for example, if you have hardware that must be replaced or changed, right, then that lends you toward migration instead of even considering an upgrade. If the operating system must be updated and the currently installed version of Config Manager doesn't support upgrading the OS in place, then we need to migrate, right? And that's true if you're coming from Config Manager 2007 or Config Manager 2012, then neither of those OSs support, neither of those versions of Config Manager support upgrading the operating system in place. In Config Manager Current Branch, we do, as of I believe it was 1602, support upgrading the operating system in place. So it really depends on what you're coming from and to, right? Another reason for migration, do you want to start fresh? Are there old or inaccurate or challenging configurations that you would rather not carry forward into your new environment? Certainly a reason to do an upgrade. Another, simplifying complex hierarchies. So you'll see a diagram in a minute that tries to illustrate this, but saw a lot of environments, especially in Configuration Manager 2007, where there would be multiple layers of parent-child relationships, and it really got into a pretty significant level of complexity that is just not needed and adds delays and so forth, and isn't supported at all in Configuration Manager Current Branch, or 2012 for that matter. And so being able to streamline complex hierarchies into as simple of an approach as possible, right? Whether that be a standalone primary or if you do require a CAS and child primary sites, right? Now, to that point as well, there's lots of customers that come from 2007 and carry forward that mentality that they had in 2007 and just knee-jerk react to putting a CAS in place. Thankfully, that's reduced a lot now, but really think through this, right? If you did do that, if you have implemented Configuration Manager 2012, or even Current Branch for that matter, and you have a CaaS, but you really don't have a need for it in terms of scale, and that's most environments probably on the planet, then a standalone primary is a really good option for you. But once you have a CaaS in place, the only way to get back to that standalone primary is to do a reinstall. That would put us into a migration scenario, right? If you need to restructure the architecture, kind of part and parcel to that, restructure the architecture based on learnings and experiences, then a migration from the old infrastructure to the new infrastructure could be very applicable. So the demo I'm going to show you here, again, is very kind of an overview of how migration works and so on, but it's going to focus in on a standalone primary because, again, most environments don't need more than that, right? And being able to be as streamlined and such is really important to avoid that complexity. Okay, so what are the requirements for migration? Well, really the main thing, you need to have a supported version of Config Manager. These versions that I show on the screen are the supported versions of Config Manager. And yes, this discussion is geared to talk about migrating from Configuration Manager 2007 and 2012, but there is also the concept of migrating in a Configuration Manager Current Branch environment, which is why I include it. You'll see some diagrams on that as we roll forward. So having these versions of Config Manager will help you toward migration. So some supported scenarios, again, for Config Manager migration, just talked about them. We can go from 2007 to Current Branch, 2012 to Current Branch, or Current Branch to Current Branch. So let's talk about the data for a minute, right? So if we are in Configuration Manager 2007, essentially we're going to either have a single source site or we're going to have a hierarchy of sites. So if you have that single source site and you want to move to a single standalone primary, that's the one I didn't put up here, absolutely possible, right? Or if you have that single source site and you want to move to multiple destination sites, that's fine. Or the other way as well, multiple source sites to a single destination site, that works. And that's what I'll show you on the diagram in just a minute. But what about data in Config Manager 2012 or Current Branch? So in a Config Manager 2012 or Current Branch environment, you are either going to have a single primary, standalone primary, or a CaaS. So if you're in either scenario, if you're migrating from a single primary or a CaaS environment to a single primary or CaaS environment, the data is the same. In 2007, you had the ability to have data created uniquely at every primary site in the hierarchy. Said another way, we did have the central site in Configuration Manager 2007, and that was the site for centralized administration. If you were going to build configurations that would be visible across the entire environment, then you would build those at the central site. But it was totally supported to build configurations, collections, and packages and so forth directly on a child primary. And if you did that, then the central site would have no record of those at all, right? Because it's localized to that child primary. That is not true in Config Manager 2012 or Current Branch. In that scenario, we don't really think of a site-by-site kind of configuration. We think of a hierarchy as a whole, meaning that data that you create at any primary in the site or at the CaaS is visible on all of the sites in the hierarchy. There are some exceptions. That gets into a discussion of global versus local data and so forth. But for packages and collections and things of that nature that you would create, those are all global data. They would be visible globally, right? Okay. So in terms of migration, as we kind of start to dip our toe into this a bit, just defining a few terms, and then we'll see the flow and really see an example of how this works. So specifically, source hierarchy. There is the concept of a source hierarchy. Now, it might be a single site, but still, it would be referred to as a hierarchy. That will be the hierarchy that you are migrating from, where you want to take the data from that hierarchy and migrate it to another configuration that you've built, right? Little tangent point here, right? As we talk about migration, migration implies that both the source hierarchy and the new hierarchy will maintain operation simultaneously, and that is certainly true, right? That is the intention of migration, is that you can stand up a new site, migrate data over, get that site prepared, both sites continue to operate and serve the needs of clients, and you can even move things over in kind of a staged way and so forth. And there will be a point in time in which the migration is completed, and then, and only then, will you shut down the source hierarchy in favor of the new hierarchy, because everything will be over there now, right? Source server is the server inside the source hierarchy that you're attaching to pull data and migrate data, okay? So there is the ability to connect to multiple servers within a source hierarchy. I'll show you that in the diagram here in a moment. One thing to call out here, you may be able to form, you can form, multiple relationships between the new hierarchy and the source hierarchy and point to multiple servers within that source hierarchy. The key thing to note is if you do that, you can only have one source hierarchy configuration active at a time. So plan that out and start where you need to get the most data and so forth, and then get rid of that and move on to another to synchronize the data in and so forth, right? So you'll see that in the diagram in just a minute. So when you have a source hierarchy, that's where you learn about the hierarchy you're migrating from and figure out what data you can actually migrate. Nothing actually gets migrated from the source hierarchy until you build and run migration jobs. And it can be one migration job, it can be multiple migration jobs, whatever you need to get the job of migrating done, then we can build that, right? And then finally, there's the concept of distribution point migration. And one more that I probably should mention here, this migration situation is not something that will happen forever in an environment. Certainly it can last a period of time, and the idea is that these things will run simultaneously and these processes will gather data proactively to keep the environments in sync until you get done with the job of migrating. But there will be a point in which that job of migration will be done. And so then there's a piece in ConfigMgr that will allow you to clean up these migration tasks, and that will be in the console that you will see in just a minute. Okay? All right, so here's an example of a Configuration Manager 2007 hierarchy. Here we have a central site. We have a couple of primaries underneath that, a couple of primaries underneath those, and then a secondary underneath the one primary, right? Not a typical, but not an atypical Configuration Manager 2007 structure. So the purple arrows are showing you the source hierarchy configuration. So the main source of the migration will be the central site, moving to a Config Manager current branch standalone primary. Again, calling back to the complexities that were so much a part of Configuration Manager 2007 and previous versions. Very often you would have hierarchy design sprawl that really is not needed at all in a Configuration Manager current branch configuration. There were reasons for it actually in Config Manager 2007, but really those reasons aren't even applicable. They don't exist in Configuration Manager current branch for a number of different reasons, right? But see, here for a 2007 site, you can absolutely have a source relationship between your standalone primary and your central site, grab the data from there, and then move on to have a relationship between your standalone primary and one of the child primary sites, or however many child primary sites you need to gather data that might be stored locally there. The end result being, you've taken this entire structure and moved it to a single primary site. Now, one of the objections, and I'll probably mention this again, one of the objections that was raised whenever we came up with the whole idea of migration is the need for multiple servers, the need for duplicate servers, right? People would look at their Config Manager 2007 implementation, see how many servers they have there, then think about the Config Manager current branch implementation or even 2012 implementation and think, well, I need to have exactly the same number of servers in Config Manager 2012 or current branch that I do in 2007. That is not true, clearly, from this diagram, right? So yes, in migration scenarios, you will need to have hardware that can accommodate what you're migrating from. But it's not a one-to-one relationship, and there's some more thoughts on that as we kind of go through this discussion a bit more. So that's 2007. What about 2012? Well, 2012 is the same kind of idea, except now really probably most likely all you need to do is worry about a source relationship between your current branch standalone primary, or CaaS, and the CaaS of the 2012 site or hierarchy you're migrating from. Why? Because all of the data in 2012 is global data that you would care to migrate. And so having that relationship with the CaaS gives you all that information that you need and can migrate it from there, right? And so contrast the two, again, 2007 migration example versus the 2012 migration example. So let's actually go through this and see how this works. Let me pull in my configuration. Well, let's start with Configuration Manager 2007. So whenever I first set this up, it was quite the experience to install Configuration Manager 2007 again. It had been years since I had seen and worked with this console, still very familiar, but not going to spend much time here, but just to show you, in this Config Manager test environment, I've configured a few things. I have specifically for software distribution a couple of packages that we will use. I also have a couple of boot images here, also a task sequence that we can pull over. Have also, I have a configuration item here that I created and so on. Just a few items, right? Just to give you an idea. In addition, I have a couple of custom collections down here that I've created. So enough about 2007. Let's move over to our current branch site and then walk through how that migration would actually work. So here's my current branch site. All right, so if we're trying to set up migration, that is done through the administration node. And the migration tab here, a few things that are interesting. I've got a few things configured here already just from previous work I did, but we'll walk through this and kind of look through what these items look like. So let's start on the source hierarchy. So I can go create a new entry to specify a different source hierarchy. Now, I already have a source hierarchy here. If I proceed to specify another one, then effectively this one will not be active any longer. I can only have one source hierarchy active at a time, right? But this wizard is going to simply ask me, hey, source hierarchy, is it a new source hierarchy? What is it kind of deal? And then what is the FQDN of my server in the source hierarchy that I want to connect to? So thinking about that 2007 diagram, it would be the central site, or later after that, it could be one of the child primaries or whatever. Then I'm going to be asked to specify a user account or a computer account and whether I want to use that same one to access the SMS provider. And then finally, do I want to enable distribution point sharing for the source site server? Little word about that, right? So from especially for Config Manager 2007, in Configuration Manager 2007, we had a distribution point format that was essentially just a glorified file share, right? In Config Manager 2012, we modified that to be a single instance store. So thinking about the shared distribution point scenario from 2007 to 2012 or even current branch, you can absolutely do that. However, while you're sharing the distribution point, both sites need to be able to use it. So there will be a point at which that distribution point just uses the flat file format because that's what the 2007 clients need to be able to get to understand, and that's how Configuration Manager 2007 is engineered. At some point, you will be ready to flip that site to only use the distribution point related to Config Manager current branch, right? And at that point, we will shift it over to the single instance store and so forth. So we do have the example here that's running, it's ready to go, etc. So if I right click on this and click on configure, this is going to show you exactly what I just walked you through, just configured. So as soon as you were to finish this wizard, what would happen next is there's a process we would go through called data gathering, right? So I've already gone through it once. I can trigger it again manually, gather data now. I can go to properties on this. Well, let's go through gather data now. So I'm going to gather data from my 2007 site, pull it over. Now my 2007 site is really easy, right? doesn't take long to do this because it's so simple. In a complex environment, it might take hours to do this, a couple hours at least, for each data gathering run. So be aware of that. And the point of data gathering is to keep these two sites in sync. Both of them are going to be active for a period of time, and you want any changes made in the 2007 environment to get reflected over in the current branch environment, right? And so this data gathering job keeps that running, okay? So the data gathering job can be run on a schedule. It is scheduled for every 4 hours by default, and then you can go in here and again gather data if you want to. Shows the last time it ran successfully, and so on. So this helps you gather data and move it over. Actually, I said move it over. That is not true. This data gathering does not move anything. It simply learns about the items in the ConfigMgr 2007 infrastructure that may be of interest to migrate, but it doesn't migrate anything. The job of migrating is left to migration jobs, right? And so the migration jobs are where you specify what and how you want to migrate. So there are a couple of test ones that I have going on here, and there are a couple of ways to migrate. Let me walk you through that. So if I create a new migration job, there are 3 types of jobs. So I'll just call this test 1. I won't save this first one, but there's a type of job known as a collection migration job. That's in this dropdown. There's also the object migration job, and then there's the objects modified after migration job. So probably makes sense just from the names, but a collection migration will take the collection, analyze it, allow you to migrate the collection, and then because collections are used as the target for deployments in Configuration Manager at all, 2007, 2012, current branch makes no difference, right? There may be deployments targeted to those collections. And so by looking at the deployments, we can then identify objects that would be potentially available to migrate, and then choose to migrate those as part of this wizard. Whereas the object migration will bypass the collections and look specifically at objects that are configured in the 2007 environment or 2012, the source hierarchy, and allow you to choose which ones of those to pull over. And then the third option, as these two sites stay active together, then there will be changes in the source site, and this third kind of job will allow you to pick up those changes and move them over, right? So we have collection migration in focus. Click next. So here we see all of our collections, and this box down here to say migrate objects that are associated, but that's there by default. I can choose just my custom collections and move forward. And so then I get this error because I don't actually have any active deployments to those collections, so I won't discover any objects, so I will remove this, move forward. Now, we're asked to define what security scopes these objects that we're migrating should actually be in. We're given the option to create a security scope if we don't have one, right? So this kind of is another tangent. The idea of migration is to take a functioning ConfigMgr 2007, 2012 site, current branch site, and migrate it to a new site that you're building. Before you start that migration, there is need to be able to go through that new site, build out the configurations you expect you would need, whether that be security scopes, security roles, whatever that is, and have that ready so that whenever the migration happens, it just plugs into those areas that you've created. Here's an example of that. I could go create a security scope. I don't need to in my lab, so I'm just going to choose the default because everything's part of default and move forward. Now, this section will identify any collections that are included where there's a challenge because of the way those collections are limited, right? This is, I said before, that ConfigMgr 2012 current branch is a totally new product compared to ConfigMgr 2007, right? The concepts are the same. Using collections are very similar, but the underneath the hood kind of components are different. And here's a good example of that. In ConfigMgr 2007, there was no requirement to limit collections. In Configuration Manager 2012 and current branch, there is. And so this would call out any collections that are in a state where you need to take action on them before they migrate. Right? In my case, I don't have any in that category, but I do have one here. This one will look at collection query rules and identify any where the collection query specifically calls out a site code. Because when you do the migration, the new site you're migrating to will not have the same site code. It can't, right? Site codes must be unique in the environment. Since both of these environments are running simultaneously, they have to have unique site codes. And then allow you to specify what the destination site code should be. We'll modify the query accordingly. You see, I just have one destination site code. If I were in a hierarchy, I would have a couple of options, right? But this will give you the chance to, on the fly, correct an ambiguity in the migration process that would otherwise pass and not be functional. And then finally, review any information, run through the settings of this. So this is where we'll end for this particular iteration of the wizard. Here you can actually specify to run the migration job as soon as you're finished, not run it, plan to run it on a schedule, how you want to handle duplicated objects, etc. Right? So that's collection-based migration. What about the second kind of job that is object-based? So here we're not looking at collections at all. We're looking instead at objects, the packages, the software updates, the task sequences and such, right? So I have a couple of software distribution packages. I have some boundaries. You can migrate boundaries. That's good news for anyone who spent hours and hours researching and finding boundaries and manually typing them in, right? You can also migrate task sequences and such. So let me show you the task sequence and show you this, right? So I selected a task sequence. There's one task sequence, and it shows up here. But specifically, we call out a dependency. There is a dependency this task sequence has on the boot image. You can't migrate just the task sequence without the boot image, and so this gives you the opportunity to include it. Right? So here's another tangent. In Configuration Manager Current Branch, the ADK version that we need is different than what you have on 2007 or 2012. There may be boot images you've created and constructed based on the previous versions of the ADK, and for whatever reason, this particular task sequence requires that boot image. That's okay. Just carry it along. You can't edit it in a current branch environment, right? It needs to match the version of the ADK installed to be editable, but it certainly can be used. So if you need to bring that forward, then this wizard helps you identify that dependency, add it to the mix, and then continue forward. And then as the wizard runs, we will look at source site information and allow you to decide what is the destination site that I want to configure. In this case, I just have a standalone primary site, so it's an easy answer. You could specify child primary sites as the owner of a particular piece of content if you wanted to. I can't think of a reason in a Config Manager Current Branch or even 2012 scenario where you would want to do that. Object ownership doesn't matter that much. It's visible at all of the sites. So having the CAS own it makes a lot of sense, right? Okay, and then finally, looking at the security scope again. So yeah, I'm in the default, review the information that I have, look at settings, and this time I will configure this. I'm going to say don't run, and then override all objects, and then click next, and then click next, and I'm finished. So I have this migration job created, test one. So I can go start this now. And it will say yes, and then go look at the results of migration, objects in the job. And I can see the status of the objects in the job just by pulling this up. And if I refresh this, it will show me any updates that they're migrated already. So you see some of the changes and deltas there, right? And so all of these went through really fast. Why did they go through really fast? Because I had previously migrated them. These two jobs migrated various objects. So these packages were migrated up at the top. This set migrated the packages, and you see these were skipped because I'd already done them, right? Boot images and so forth, and then so on, right? Okay. So that's migration jobs. The third type didn't really show you, but it's very similar. Let's create another migration job. I'll just call it test 2, is to take objects that have already been migrated and move them over again, right? So this will tell you whether you have objects that are maybe new versions of things that have already been migrated, and you can create a job to pull those over so that we stay in sync. So maybe it's a good practice. As you get done with your migration jobs and you think you have all the objects migrated, then run this job and it will identify things that maybe left on the source site that you thought were migrated, but they weren't, right? Or different versions of them were, okay? All right. And then while we're here, continuing to think through this, we have distribution point migration. So the distribution point migration node is when you have distribution points configured to see the distribution points that are eligible for migration or even sharing would be here, shared distribution points. So notice I have 2 distribution points that are here. Oops, I lost that view. Where'd it go? There it is. Okay, let's pull this up. Pull it up. Okay, good. So shared distribution points. Make this bigger. So you notice I have 2 distribution points. Here's my central site server. Here is a remote distribution point. And you see eligible for reassignment, no or yes, right? And depending on the configuration of the distribution point means whether it can be reassigned or not. Details are in the documentation about that, but certain things about that would include, are there other components installed on this server with a distribution point? Are there things that need to be removed in order to make this eligible for migration? In the case of the central site server where there's a distribution point, there are obviously a lot of other components on that server. So migrating that, taking ownership of that by a new site it's not possible because there's so many other conflicting components. Whereas the highlighted one is simply a distribution point and can be reassigned to a site in the new hierarchy or shared with the site in the new hierarchy and so forth, right? So again, if that's of interest, take a bit more look at that in detail. It's a good thing to do. It saves redistributing content and so forth and makes it a nice approach for managing distribution points without having to re-push everything. A couple of other items. There is the ability to configure an exclusion list. You see it right here, being able to edit the exclusion list in a couple of places to exclude certain objects from migration and so on. There's also the cleanup wizard. So once you're done and you want to clean up all the migration data, just use this button to start to clean up all the migration components and you're done, right, with that particular migration. Now, there may be another site where you want to create a migration relationship and you can go through that and then clean it up too and keep going until you're done with the migration, okay? So at this point, we've worked through the source hierarchy. We've worked through having a migration job and seeing that gather data and actually see that pull across some data. And so one more thing that I want to chat about while we're here. So if we go to our software library and go, oh, and let me talk about software updates too. So you saw software updates is an item that is eligible for migration, but there's an exception here. So in ConfigMgr 2007, we allowed the category of drivers to be selected under software updates. That is not a supported category for ConfigMgr 2012 or current branch, and so that particular item won't migrate. Everything else will, right? And so you would have different software update configurations. The grouping in 2007 turned into software update groups and so forth, right? But it's totally supported. So under application management, we have a couple of packages that came over. These are the 2 packages, right? Now, packages work great in ConfigMgr current branch, but they are a very legacy kind of a technology. If you want to deploy applications That's why we have the application model. And so anyone coming from a ConfigMgr 2007 environment will only have packages. If you want to get them into the application model and start to learn the application model, having a way to convert those packages to applications is very helpful. And we've had the Package Conversion Manager tool for a long time. Now it is integrated into the console, and you see it here, right? So this is actually, as of this recording, a pre-release feature. It was introduced in ConfigMgr 1806, and you do have to enable it for it to be here in the console. But once it's here, you can run through the process to analyze the package and move it over and so on. So I have both of my packages here, right? And I can analyze these, and the analysis will be done, and it will fail for both of them. Why will it fail for both of them? Well, there's some rules in the analysis piece that will either pass or fail. If the rules fail, then you need to take some corrective action on the package and then rerun it, right? So let me show you. So if I go into this demo MSI, one specific one is in my data source, and this is true for both of these packages. I'm using a particular drive on the site server. That worked great in Configuration Manager 2007, but here this may make no sense. This source directory may not be true. So if I set that, the recommendation is to always use a UNC. That way I can just refer to the name of the server and so on by UNC. In fact, I'm going to shortcut this because I know I don't recall. Actually, this probably does exist here. Lab server CB $C. Let's see if I actually have that share. Okay, so I do. So I'm changing it to UNC. That way it's universal on the package. And as long as that UNC exists, we're good. So I can go analyze the package again. It's analyzing it. And now there looks to be a different failure, but not that one, right? And so this one has the same challenge as the previous one. Anyway, so being in the console makes it really easy to look at these packages, analyze them, figure out what's wrong with them perhaps, and then be able to convert them directly into the app model. Now, specifically on the MSI, one of the challenges with the MSI, or at least things to be aware of. So in this case, this demo MSI is pointing at a MSI version of MSXML6. It's in the client directory, just pulled that as an example, and it would work great, right? When you converted it, would work great. There are some organizations that are in the habit of rewrapping MSIs so that they can add instructions around, right? Totally get it. Especially in 2007, there was no ability to do some things around package deployment that organization wants, such as setting dependencies or controlling when to install it or setting up supersedence relationships or those kinds of things that you do have now in Configuration Manager application model. So they would wrap it. And that's great. It worked fine. The challenge is, as you go through the wizard here, the analysis wizard, and do the conversion, if you have a wrapped MSI, one of the things that's required in the application model in Configuration Manager Current Branch 2012 is to have what's called a detection method, some way to know whether that app is installed or whether it's not, right? If you point at an MSI and that MSI happens to be a wrapper around another MSI, then the detection logic will be focused on the wrapper, not the MSI inside the wrapper, right? So if we do the conversion analysis and then the conversion works on this particular package, it will create an application, but the detection logic will be focused on the wrapper, not what's inside, right? Assuming you're wrapping your MSIs. So be aware of that. The other thing is whenever you specify detail about uninstall strings and so on, if you're pointing at the wrapper, that's not going to give you the desired results that you want. You really want to be focused on the MSI or the deployment that's contained within the wrapper, right? Okay. So another thing about that before we leave, if we go to monitoring and roll all the way down to the bottom, there is a dashboard that will show you the package conversion status. So all of our packages have been analyzed. They have not been converted at all because they are in an error state, right? So we don't know about some of them, right? Because not everything is converted that's in the package node, but 20% of them are in an error state, and so forth, right? So this just kind of gives you a glimpse at what's going on in the environment. And so here, again, I can run package conversion analysis from here if I want to, and so on, right? So it's just a nice little dashboard. Okay, so let's get rid of the lab environment, all right? So a couple of additional thoughts about migration, okay? So we talked about software updates, how the driver category is present in 2007, is not supported in Configuration Manager 2012 or current branch, and so those items cannot be migrated at all. We talked about the package conversion manager and the MSI stuff and how that works, and how it can skew detection logic or the uninstall command line screen. The third option is a physical to virtual consideration. So specifically here with migration, whenever we announced that you could not upgrade a Configuration Manager 2007 hierarchy to 2012 in the day, and certainly now to current branch, there was angst about that. And one of the concerns expressed was that now, with this being the case, duplicative hardware will need to be purchased because you can't, you need the extra hardware to be able to install and do the migration. And that's certainly a true statement. Now, a couple of points there. Whenever customers would express that concern, they would express it in a way that would suggest there was a one-to-one comparison between the hardware they have today and the hardware they need to purchase in order to support the migration. And that's not true. If we go back in the diagram and just look at the Configuration Manager 2007 information in the hierarchy, we will clearly see that you could, in many situations, support totally converting or migrating, if you would, a 2007 infrastructure into one current branch site, a standalone primary site. Right? The vast majority of Configuration Manager installations in the world don't need more than a single primary site due to the scale that single primary site can support, 150,000 clients. Right? If you have 150,000 clients or less, you probably will be just fine with a standalone primary site. So yes, you do need extra hardware, but it's not saying that today you have 6 servers supporting your Configuration Manager 2007 environment, or 3 servers supporting your 2012 environment, and you need to have the exact same number of servers that you're migrating to. No, not at all. It might just be 1 server, right? So bear that in mind. But the other comment here, again, is to this physical to virtual. It could be that your physical hardware is just fine to support the new current branch installation. The problem is that it's currently running 2007 or 2012. So specifically in 2007 world, there was a tool introduced called P2V. Oh, what was that thing called? The Configuration Manager Physical to Virtual Migration Toolkit. Now, when I was preparing this, I went out and found the toolkit references and blogs and so on. I never actually got my hands on the toolkit. I'm sure it's still out there. I just didn't look probably hard enough, but it's specifically designed to support virtualizing your Configuration Manager 2007 servers and converting them into a format that you can plug directly into Hyper-V. Now, you may not want to use Hyper-V ongoing, and that's fine. The idea is you can virtualize your 2007 infrastructure, or maybe even a server or 2 out of that, to free up enough resources to allow you to install your current branch installation on those servers or on that server. And then you can migrate and be up and running, right? Maybe the Hyper-V solution, because of the way you structure it, doesn't perform as well as physical hardware. Understand, right? That this gives you that option to be able to virtualize these things and migrate from 2007. Again, that's specifically a Config Manager 2007 tool. Okay, so that's migration. What about upgrading? Right? Upgrading is a different discussion. In some ways, an easier discussion. We'll talk about it. So why upgrade? What are the requirements for upgrading? What are some of the scenarios we would talk through? What's the flow of upgrading? And then we'll end this section with a few more thoughts about upgrading there as well. Here I don't have a demo because this kind of upgrade approach is something we've used for you, so we'll just kind of talk through it. I do have a couple of diagrams in here. So in terms of why upgrading, you can add a number of different things to this list. I've got a couple, and you'll probably think about a couple of more as we're talking through it. But if you want to reuse your existing hardware, yeah, upgrade, right? And that's fine, and we totally support an upgrade as long as you're not on 2007. If you're a 2012 environment, you can absolutely upgrade that all day long, no problem. If you are comfortable that your existing architecture meets your ongoing needs, then upgrade it to current branch, right? That means that you have a CaaS and you do need a CaaS. You need to carry that forward. And you're comfortable with the number of primary sites you have and you need to carry that forward. You know, you can remove primary sites if you need to, even as part of the upgrade at some point. You can add primary sites. The only thing you can't do is change to a standalone primary site environment if you have a CaaS without reinstalling, right? So if your existing architecture meets your ongoing needs, yeah, use it, upgrade it, right? If you're not concerned, another one you could add, if you're not concerned about the data in your current database and you're satisfied that it's clean enough to upgrade, yeah, upgrade, no problem. You know, that's great. In terms of scenarios, there are largely InPlace upgrades, and then there's the idea of a new site or a hierarchy, which I then hear you say, yeah, that's great, Steve, I get the InPlace upgrade, but what about this new site or hierarchy? That sure doesn't sound like an upgrade to me. Well, hang with me and we'll talk about that. So when it comes to the InPlace upgrade, we have options, right? So you could have an existing ConfigMgr 2012 site that's moving to current branch. That's one type of InPlace upgrade. Or you could have an existing ConfigMgr current branch site that you need to move to a newer version of current branch on different hardware. That's another, on the same hardware. That's another kind of upgrade. Yes, Steve, that's the kind of upgrade we do all the time as new versions of ConfigMgr release. Granted, absolutely true. But that is certainly a type of InPlace upgrade that we're doing routinely now in the current branch environment. There's operating system configuration, operating system considerations here. Maybe you have a system where the host operating system is installed and you're fine with that server. You just need to upgrade the operating system, right? So you're going to go ahead and upgrade ConfigMgr, and then you want to upgrade the operating system underneath. That's totally fine. As long as you're on ConfigMgr 1602, I believe it was, and forward, then we totally support upgrading the operating system underneath the ConfigMgr site, okay? There could be hierarchy structure concerns that would kind of lean toward an upgrade InPlace scenario. So if the hierarchy is currently deployed and a standalone site is desired, then you will need to install that site from scratch and migrate the data. So in that case, the InPlace upgrade won't work. But if it's desired to change the site codes during the upgrade, you'll need to install fresh and do a migration, right? So InPlace upgrade, some considerations there that will keep you from doing it, some considerations there that will help you along the way toward that end, okay? New site and or hierarchy, right? So if your hierarchy needs to be restructured, that's going to lend itself to a new site or a hierarchy. If your systems are going to require you to change site codes or computer names or whatever, then yeah, you need to have a new site or hierarchy, just as I was talking about under hierarchy structure. That really probably should have been a bullet under new site hierarchy, but you get the idea, right? If you have hardware that needs to be updated, then that's going to lend itself to a new site or a hierarchy. If it's a totally new install, obviously it's a new site or a hierarchy. Great, Steve, this all makes sense. How does this lend itself to an upgrade scenario? Well, hang with me and we'll talk about that. Okay, so in terms of the flow for the upgrade, here's Configuration Manager 2007. And I put this here on purpose to put a big X through it and say you can't upgrade a Config Manager 2007 hierarchy. You must migrate. That's the only option available. So then let's look at Config Manager 2012. So this slide is just kind of give you the idea. So on the left-hand side, we have the prerequisites that should be kind of looked at and followed. This comes largely from the documentation that I pulled together. And ideas before you start the upgrade, and then post-upgrade actions when the upgrade is finished. In terms of the hierarchy, right, this is kind of the flow. So this is a Config Manager 2012 hierarchy. We have our CAS, sorry, I left that around, it should be CAS. CAS, a primary site, and then the secondary site underneath a primary. How do we do this? Well, we've done upgrades like this for a long time. You start at the top level site, fully upgrade the top level site, and then once that's done, move down to your primaries, upgrade your primaries one at a time all the way through until they're fully upgraded, and then once you're done with the primaries, go to your secondaries if you still have them. Total tangent. If you still have secondaries, ask yourself the question why, right? Vast majority of cases, you don't need secondaries. Secondaries just add additional load into the environment or complexity in the environment that you may not need. A little factoid about secondaries. There were definite places where secondaries were beneficial and needed in a Configuration Manager 2007 or previous configuration. With some of the architectural changes, that's largely just not true anymore. And in fact, secondary sites were often implemented to help optimize network traffic and to reduce network traffic, frankly. In Config Manager 2012 forward, secondary sites require a database of their own, which means they participate in replication, which means there's additional traffic because of replication. And so now you have to decide, are you really getting ahead of the curve with that secondary site, or if you just trust the throttling that's within Config Manager 2012 and current branch, can you get rid of that secondary site? Again, big tangent, finished with the tangent, but if you do keep the secondary site and you want to upgrade it, then that can be done from inside the console once you get to your primary site that's related to it up to Config Manager current branch, right? So that's kind of the flow there. So what about if you're building a new Config Manager current branch hierarchy? So this is, again, it's not the upgrade scenario we've been talking about with 2007 and 2012, but it's important, right? So here you might be building a completely new hierarchy. You might want to build, I'm going to pick some numbers here just from memory. You might want to build a new CAS, right? And you might be looking to get to version 16.10 of Config Manager. Hopefully you're going to get to the latest version of Config Manager, but for the sake of this argument or for this discussion, let's say you want to get to 16.10. And so you build that CAS and you build it with the most recent baseline media available, which I believe, I could be wrong on this, it's been a while, but I believe 1602 was the baseline media at the time. So you would build the CAS at 1602, and then you need to get it to 1610, so you would not do anything else at all until you upgrade that CAS to 1610, right? Because you want to upgrade one time after you do the install. So now the CAS is at 1610, you still need to deploy a couple of primaries, so now there's actually a folder on the CAS called cd.latest. And so if you run setup on your primary sites from cd.latest, you can install those primary sites at 1610 that matches the CAS and connect the sites and off you go. Now be careful with cd.latest because it is fully supported in a configuration like that, but it is not supported in certain other configurations. So if you're going to use that, just be aware of it and use that selectively and make sure it is supported for your benefit. All right, and then the last kind of upgrade scenario is stuff we've done all the time. So I just mention it here for completeness, and that is if you have a current branch hierarchy that you're upgrading from one version to the next. That's a built-in thing to Configuration Manager current branch now, so it just flows like it always has. Just use the updates and servicing feature and you can control that. So a couple of additional thoughts on that would be, just analyze what your needs are, what your configurations are, use the upgrade scenario as it makes sense, right? And it'll help you out and so on. So a word about Azure Infrastructure as a Service, right? And you can probably add to this. So the bulk of what we wanted to discuss was in the migration and the upgrade categories. Azure fully supports Configuration Manager Current Branch. It kind of supports, or it does support, Configuration Manager 2012, but it's different, right? So Configuration Manager Current Branch, you can have whatever kind of site structure you want in Azure. You can have a standalone primary, you can have a CaaS with a few primaries attached, you can have it on-prem, managing resources in Azure, you can have it in Azure, managing resources in on-prem and in Azure, whatever you want, right? Azure is just an extension of your data center. Config Manager 2012 is supported in Azure, but only a single primary. And there's some limitations as to direction of management. And then Config Manager 2007 is not supported in Azure at all. The point is, it may benefit you to put your Configuration Manager Current Branch system into Azure and then migrate from your existing platforms, 2007 or 2012, to that. Frankly, you can migrate from a current branch on-prem to current branch in Azure if you wanted to, right? So what this would do if we're in Azure is avoid the requirement to purchase and maintain additional hardware. Here's another thing, actually point 4 that I'm going to link here. When you purchase the hardware, that's the hardware you have to work with for the duration of whatever the purchase cycle is, or however long you keep Configuration Manager around. It could be that you need to update the configuration on the fly and be able to use it that way. Azure allows you those kind of flexibilities. So you aren't really locked in. You can start with a configuration you think will meet your needs. You can scale up if you need to. You can scale down if you need to, whatever the needs of that VM in your management environment is. And then finally, as Config Manager admins delivering management services to your environment, if you have your infrastructure in Azure, it really does allow you to focus on delivering that value of management, what you're trying to do to manage the devices that you have in your infrastructure versus having to factor in maintaining the hardware, right? That's the job of our job in Azure, is to maintain your hardware. We want to make sure that you have working hardware so that, or working systems so that you can do the job of management the way you need to do it. So that said, we will wrap the session here. That's really what I wanted to cover. Thanks for hanging out with me, and we will see you next time. Happy migrating.